Hey guys, and welcome to the April Rereadathon Reflections video. This month's prompt was to read a book set in a different world or different country/culture. I plan on doing both if you've been keeping up with my channel at all. And I'm going to start with the one set in a different world just because I actually really want to get into these books right now. So that is The Immortals Quartet by Tamora Pierce. There's Wild Magic, Wolf Speaker, Emperor Mage, and the Realms of the Gods. I have read this series so many times. Much like the Alana series, these are very much staples of my childhood. I started reading these when I was about 12 and I never stopped reading them. And the interesting thing about these books is that, like, unlike most of the other books or most of the other series that I have reread several times, I tend to go into series and just like reread the entire thing again. This series, I didn't do that. I picked out different books and I would just read them at random whenever I wanted. So I've read Emperor Mage so many times. There's a reason this copy is just like incredibly beat up. Like, this copy is dying because I've read it a lot of times. I don't even know how many. A lot. Like, this is a book that I would just pick up and read on its own. And honestly, the same with Wild Magic and the Realms of the Gods. At different times, I would say Emperor Mage is probably the one I read the most, but Wolf Speaker is very nice compared to the other books in the series. Like, the rest of them are like beat up, they have like sections missing, they're like all bent and torn, and like you can see that they're all bent. This book is in fairly decent condition because I think I've only read this book twice. Maybe only once, but I think twice, just because I've read this whole series a bunch. But I always just skip this book, so I don't really remember that much about it. I know it's important to the overall story. It was just the one that always seemed like the least relevant, the least interesting, the least fun. So I don't know, I'm very interested to see what I think of this one, because I probably haven't read this one since I was like 14 maybe. Like, it's been more than 10 years, whereas the others I'm sure I read in high school at some point. But I'm very excited to get into these. Where the Alana series is a lot of nostalgia for me, that one's almost like pure nostalgia. I can't even look at those books without just like feeling the love for like the whole Tortal universe, because that's where the story started for me. This series was a lot more, I did feel that. Like, I definitely felt the love in that regard. But it seemed better. Like, I feel like I enjoyed these better even if I love Alana a little bit more. So I'm really excited to get into these, and I will probably be picking up this book and reading it tonight, and I will try to update you guys on what I think of each of these books individually, just because I feel like I have different experiences with all of them rather than just the series as a whole. And then I will read 1,000 Splendid Suns at some point later on this month, but I'm starting with these. So I realized I didn't actually mention what these books were about the last time I updated you guys, or when I started this video. This is a middle grade fantasy series about a girl who can talk to animals. She has a magic that sort of gives her a bond with them, and it starts with talking to them, but it sort of does evolve into a whole lot more, and the series just basically follows her adventures with her teacher and everything that happens. I have finished the first two. The first one is kind of an introduction to the series. Like, there are things that happen and there is plot, but it's more introducing this character, introducing her magic, introducing her teacher, and like everything starts building. And I really do like that. Like, introductions don't always work when it's like most of a book, but everything in this is so interesting and just flows together so well that I'm just immediately invested, and this is 100% nostalgia for me. Like, just the amount of giddiness that I have when I like read lines that I remember and things that are familiar to me from years and years of rereading these books. And this was wonderful. Like, I'm so glad I reread this again for like the 12th time or however long it's been, but this was wonderful. The second one was kind of the one I was most concerned about. If I was not going to like it, I gave this one 5 stars, by the way. But this one I hadn't reread, or I've only reread it once. Like, I've either read this book once or twice, and I've read everything else in the series minimum 4 or 5 times. But this book, I just never wanted to pick up again. But I also gave this 5 stars. Like, I really enjoyed this. There was less of that nostalgia for me, because because I haven't read this book as often because it's not as familiar to me, but I think the plot in this, the story, is actually a lot better than the first one. But I do think the reason I didn't like it so much as a kid was because a lot of what's familiar from the first book and from the Alana books, and even later on in this series, aren't present in this book. The only two characters that have returned for this book, the only two human characters, are Dane and Numair. And Numair isn't in about half of this book. It's mostly just Dane on her own with animals. And it's a great story. It's just one of those things that I do understand why I wouldn't necessarily want to reread this. It's really good, and I loved reading it. I thought it was wonderful. But I did miss those characters. I missed the setting that was very familiar to me. I missed a lot of things that this book was kind of just not really lacking, but like it didn't have what I love about the series in it. It's just a really great book on its own. So I do understand why I didn't reread this a lot. I do think, it's an amazing book. Like, this was almost as good as the first one for me, and the first one is one of my favorite books, so it's not that this one's bad. It's just not something that I see myself rereading a lot, and I do think that's why, as a kid, I didn't love this one quite as much, but as an adult, Dane makes this book worth it. The story makes this book worth it, and I do love her relationship with the animals. It's one of those things that it does kind of suck that she is on her own for so much, and that there isn't a lot that returns from other books, but still very worth it. Loving my reread of this so far. I didn't have a chance to update after the first one entirely, and I did say that these books had less nostalgia for me than the Alana books, and that is 100% untrue. Like, there's so much nostalgia in these. Maybe once I get to Kel, there will be less nostalgia, but I'm just thinking, like, in general, these Tamora Pierce books, these are nostalgia. I love these, and I'm so excited to read the third and fourth ones. I have just barely started the third one, like 5 pages in, and it's wonderful. I love the third one. I think the third one is my favorite, so my reread of that is going to be so much fun. A quick update video. I did finish this book last night, and while Wolfspeaker very much surprised me in my feelings on it, this book didn't surprise me at all. I absolutely loved it. It's not so much that I feel that it's, like, better than any of the other books. Like, I feel like it's equally as good and that I very much love it. And it's a very good book. But it just hits on, like, every trope that I love. And it's so happy-making. And I really enjoy it. Like, it's just such a fun book to read. And I don't know, like, it was amazing. Like, it was amazing. I love the climax of this book. Like, of all Tamora Pierce's books, I feel like the climax of this is the best, or my favorite at least. Like, it's just amazing. Like, it's the kind of book that I get so excited reading it that I have to, like, pause every couple of pages just to, like, calm down and, like, contain myself to continue reading. And it's wonderful. I don't really have that much to say about this book because, like, I can't talk specifically about the tropes that I like because they're major spoilers for this, but this one's amazing. This is a favorite. Like, this is why I've reread this one more than anything else, and this is why it's, like, falling apart, because I've read it so many ridiculous number of times, and it's wonderful. This book is wonderful, and I'm starting in the Realm of the Gods, or the Realms of the Gods tonight, and looking forward to that one in the climax of the series. So I finished the 4th book in the Immortals Quartet, The Realms of the Gods, and this book, this was such a disappointment to me, because prior to this book, they've all held up really well. Like, not just the Immortals Quartet, but also the Song of the Lioness Quartet. Like, I had my issues with some things, but overall, like, loved reading them, still thought they were great books. This one I had more issues with. And I wound up giving it 3 stars. Like, I initially gave it 4 stars on Goodreads, and then I was like, I can't justify a 4-star rating for this book. Like, this made me cringe so hard. Like, I did overall enjoy my experience of reading this book. It was definitely not, like, a 2-star, I hated this. But I don't know if I would have liked this had it not been a childhood favorite. Overall, my issues started with, like, the actual concept of the story. There's a war going on in the country where Dane lives, and she's kind of like fighting it against like evil villains from previous books in the series, so I don't want to like spoil anything. And also like the bad Immortals, and it's called the Immortals Quartet because like the Immortals have come down, like griffins and like monsters and whatever. But at the beginning of this book, she's transported into the realm of the gods, so she spends a lot of the time in the realms of the gods just traveling around, and that's most of this book. Like she's not in Tortal fighting the war. She's in the divine realms traveling, and that's kind of boring. Like I'd rather have it be like a war type book if it's going to be that, instead of just her traveling. And like I did find that kind of boring, like not like horrifically so, but I didn't read this in one sitting. It took me like a couple of days to read it because I was just like, I don't want to read like a bunch of this at a time. Second, once we did return to Tortal, the battles and the stuff seemed like they were all happening too quickly. Like Tamora Pierce was just trying to like wrap it up real quick at the end, and it was like a little bit disjointed and a little bit too much, and I just didn't love that. But my biggest problem, dear Lord, the romance in this book. I hadn't forgotten that there was romance. Like, I did remember that there was romance, and it was like, okay, I know there's romance. Like, I loved the romance in this. Like, I reread this just for the romance, because I loved it so much as a kid. And I remembered there was an age gap. But I think I'd forgotten exactly what their ages were, because I was, like, mildly shocked and really horrified and disgusted in this book. Because Dane is 16, and in my head, I think I'd, like, aged her up to 19. But she's 16, and her love interest is 30. Or some of the reviews say 31. I don't really know. It doesn't matter. Either way, she's 16, and he's 30. And that's just horrifying and disgusting to me. Like, as an adult. Like, Jesus Christ. If Tamora Pierce wanted this to be a romance, like, fine, I get that. I don't mind a little bit of an age gap. Like, that's always something that's gonna make me cringe, but I also know that's, like, a me thing. Make Dane, like, 19 and make the dude, like, 24 or 5. Like, that's fine. I wouldn't have had an issue with that. She's 16 and he's 30. She's a literal child and he's an adult. And, like, oh, God. Like, I cringe so hard. And I loved the romance when I was a kid. Like, age 13, I thought this was fantastic. I don't know if I just didn't realize how old the guy was or how young she was, or if I just had, like, no concept, like, I'm 13, age is just a number. But, like, like, I couldn't. I pretty much got through this book just pretending that the romance didn't exist, which is kind of what I did in the prior books when it was hinted at. But, I was so disappointed. Like, she's 16 and he's 30. That's not okay. And I don't care, like, age of consent laws, whatever. If you'd be like, oh, well, in this world, she's technically an adult or whatever. Like, she's a child, okay? She's 16 and he's 30. And he's known her since she was 13. And I couldn't handle that at all. And I was disappointed. And I should have known that was coming. I'd just forgotten their ages. So that was kind of my bad. But it was such a disappointing end. Such a good series. Because the first 3 books went so well. And I really enjoyed them. But it was just unnecessary to have a relationship like that, a romantic relationship like that in this book. Like, I did something like that as a teenager, and I kind of wonder if it was books like this that kind of made me think that was okay, because, like, it's not. And this book was a whole lot of cringe, and I was just so disappointed that, like, it was that bad, because I was expecting it to be a little rough in that regard, just because I am an adult now, and I do look at that very differently. But I wasn't expecting it to be this bad, and I don't know. I wouldn't fault anyone for, like, giving this book 1 or 2 stars for that. Like, I gave it 3, but I think a lot of that is nostalgia for this series, and not just solely based on my overall feelings, because, like, I rate based on overall feelings, and that's obviously heavily influenced by how I felt about this book prior to just picking it up. So, yeah, I don't know. This made me cringe so hard. I'm next going to be reading 1,000 Splendid Suns, which I can't pick up because the stack of books that is holding up my phone includes 1,000 Splendid Suns. I don't really have much of an introduction for this book. I just know it's about 3 women, I believe, in Afghanistan. One of them is named Miriam. That's all I really remember. I know it deals with like abusive relationships and arranged marriages, and I think it's critical of certain things. I don't remember if it's historical fiction or not. I know some of his books were set in the 80s, but I don't remember if this is one, and I don't know. I loved it when I was 16, so I am very excited to get into this one again, and I will update you guys when I've made some progress on that. So I have actually finished 1,000 Splendid Suns. I have been doing a great job at updating you guys as I'm reading these books and like giving you my reactions, and not real time, but like as they happen, kind of. But I read this book all in one sitting, and it was at night, so I kind of just couldn't update you unless I just stopped reading and waited till morning in order to film. So I kind of just like went through it, and it's actually been about a week since I finished this, so all in all, I've not been great at updating this, but I did read this in order to read a book that was set in a different country / culture, because this is set in Afghanistan. It starts in the 50s, I believe, which is when the main character is born, and then it pretty much covers her life and then the life of someone in the generation after her. And they both wind up marrying the same man and dealing with his abuse, and it just covers their lives. I did really enjoy this. I gave it 4 stars, however, it was kind of an iffy 4 stars. I was on the border between giving it 3 stars and giving it 4 stars, and it made me cry in the end, which kind of just pushed me over into, okay, I'll give this 4 stars. But I had a lot more issues with it than I had the first time I read it. It was weird because, unlike my other reread books, I didn't remember much about this at all. All I remembered was that a character's name was Miriam, and I remembered an abusive relationship. And that was pretty much it. So rereading this was almost not like rereading at all, and more like reading a very popular book that I've heard like vague things about. Like if I was to pick up The Cruel Prince, it was like I'd recognize and know certain things about it, and that was about how I felt about this. Like it was an interesting reread experience for that reason, because there were some things I was like, oh, that sounds vaguely familiar, but most of it was very, very fresh for me. But I didn't enjoy it as much as I did in high school, because I do remember really loving this in high school. Like this would have been probably a solid 5 for me back in the day, and now it's like just barely a 4, and even then like I'm not quite sure it deserved 4 stars. I had some issues with the characters. The characters did feel very much like they were ideas of people rather than actual individuals. Like their personalities seemed more like conceptual rather than literal, and I didn't like that too much. And I had some other issues with like the way the history was dealt with. It was very interesting, and I really did enjoy reading about the history of Afghanistan, because I don't really know much about the history of Afghanistan. But the way it was woven into the story, it felt very like stilted and very like thrown in, and it took place like too quickly. Like I needed it to slow down. It felt like because we kept skipping sections of their lives. It'd be like sometimes it would skip ahead like 2 months, and sometimes it would skip ahead like 9 years or something like that. And it wasn't that I really hated that, it was more that it just felt like disjointed a little bit because of that, and it felt like I wanted it to slow down, and I wanted not to skip these major sections of these people's lives, because I did feel like I was missing certain things when he skipped that far ahead. And it's not a very long book. Like I think it's only like 350 pages, which is not all that long, and for the amount of information that he put in here, it just felt like too much. And it also felt a little bit like tragedy porn. Like I read a lot of sad things, and I expect heartbreak in these kind of books, but it felt like he was including every single thing that possibly could go wrong, went wrong, and was bad, and he was just making these characters' lives as bad as humanly possible. Like, and it's a war-torn country, like, I expect sad things, like, I expect it to be bad, but it felt like he went over the top, and it felt like instead of actually delving deep into the sad things that he was dealing with, into these heartbreaking issues, like abuse, like sexism, like I'm blanking on what to call other things without like spoiling. But like, instead of delving deep into those issues and actually discussing them, it felt like he was just throwing more things on top of them, and he was making it sad by adding new things instead of actually having depth within the other things, within like the main focal points. And I don't know, like it was a little bit on the edge of like tragedy porn for me, which kind of was a little off-putting. But I don't know, I did enjoy this book. I am glad I read this, because now I can discuss this like as an adult, like knowing it, and not just be like, oh, I remember really loving that. It's like, okay, like I do enjoy these aspects of the book. Like, he did make me emotionally connect with the story, with the characters. Well, not so much with the characters, but like with the overall story, he made me emotionally connect. So that was why I aired on the end of like 4 stars, because I was like, well, even with all these issues, like I was connected, I was invested, I was involved in the story and wanted to read it to the end. So kind of an iffy 4 stars. Like, this isn't gonna be like any kind of favorite of mine, but I am glad I reread it. I will be reading And the Mountains Echoed, because I did enjoy this, but I don't know. I'd rather read a better book about Afghanistan in order to like learn things, because I do feel like this was kind of on the side of 4 stars. Like, is a little bit mediocre, although good, if that makes sense. But I am happy I read it. And that concludes the April Rereadathon Reflections video. The May challenge is to reread a book from a genre you don't read very much anymore, and I haven't actually picked anything out for this yet, but I do plan to read a Hardy Boys book because I don't read middle grade mystery books anymore, and I used to really love those. And I also plan to reread a middle grade historical fiction diary, because I've read a couple of those lately, but I haven't read any of those prior to that in like literal years, and I used to love those. So I don't have specifics for either of those. It'll probably just wind up being whatever I happen to grab at the time, but that is what I plan on reading. Let me know down below if you participated this month or if you're participating next month, and what you read and what your thoughts on it are. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.